Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back through the long corridors of history, into the drafty palaces and echoing castles where royal children once played, and then, quite suddenly, found themselves on the wrong side of politics. So if your blanket is tucked in, if the room is dim, if the world feels just a little too noisy, let's soften all of that. Settle in. We'll let the past do the talking tonight. A past filled with children who were born to kings, only to discover that crowns were not nearly as secure as the jewelry implied. Now, in theory, being the son or daughter of a monarch should come with certain perks. Gold cups. Tutors who were paid in sheep. Castles with very uncomfortable chairs. But the problem, of course, is that kings tend to die in awkward ways. Sometimes in battle. Sometimes from a mysterious illness, which usually meant poison, or bad wine, or simply too much enthusiasm at dinner. And when the king fell, his children often tumbled with him. Let's drift slowly through some of their stories. Take, for example, the Plantagenets of medieval England. They are a delightful starting point, mostly because they were a large family tree where everyone hated everyone else. Picture a grand banquet hall, a roaring fire, and a table full of cousins who were all quietly plotting each other's downfall over the roasted pheasant. When Richard III fell at Bosworth Field in 1485, losing both his life and a fairly ridiculous hat, his young heir, Edward, Earl of Warwick, found himself in an awkward position. Edward was 10 years old. Which is already a difficult age. You're old enough to know that you're not invited to the adult table, but young enough to still be blamed for spilling the gravy. And unfortunately, Edward's family name had just gone out of style in the most permanent way possible. The new king, Henry VII, did what new kings always did with the children of old kings. He locked Edward in the Tower of London. Not out of necessity, you understand, but out of tradition. The Tower was less a prison and more a royal storage facility for inconvenient relatives. Edward stayed there for 14 years. He never caused trouble, never tried to escape, never plotted rebellion. Which of course meant he had to be executed. He was beheaded in 1499, not because of anything he did, but because people worried he might do something if left alive. Which tells you everything you need to know about medieval child rearing. Now let's float gently northwards, to Scotland. A land of misty castles, endless feuds, and a near-constant tradition of killing monarchs just when they were getting comfortable. James I of Scotland was assassinated in 1437. His widow, Queen Joan, grabbed their 6-year-old son James II and ran to Edinburgh Castle before anyone could decide that a 6-year-old made a convenient target. He spent his childhood guarded by soldiers, surrounded by nobles who smiled politely while sharpening daggers under the table. James grew up, eventually, but growing up in a Scottish court mostly meant developing a strong tolerance for treachery. By the age of 10, he was forced to watch his political enemies executed in ways that probably did not encourage restful sleep. He went on to reign until his 30s, when he died in a cannon explosion. Because of course he did. In medieval Scotland, even your artillery was out to get you. Children of fallen kings often faced 3 options. 1. Imprisonment. Like poor Edward of Warwick, left to grow old behind bars, his only crime being born inconveniently royal. 2. Exile. This was especially popular in France, where wayward princes could be shipped off to Brittany, Naples, or anywhere sufficiently far away that they couldn't raise an army. A royal exile might spend their life wandering half of Europe, attending banquets they weren't really welcome at, and writing letters about how, technically, they were still the rightful king. And 3. Marriage. If you couldn't kill a rival's child, you could always marry them off to someone harmless. Preferably a cousin who owned some sheep. The child was neatly removed from the succession crisis, wrapped in dowry papers, and filed away in another castle. Nowhere is this more visible than in the tragic story of the Byzantine emperors. The Byzantine court was like the world's most exhausting soap opera, except with more mosaics. When an emperor fell, his children rarely had a relaxing retirement. The boys, especially, tended to be mutilated. Yes, mutilated. Because in Byzantium, you couldn't rule if you were disfigured. So rivals would blind young princes, or cut off their noses, or both. Nothing says family values like ensuring your cousin can never sit on the throne by removing his ability to see it. For example, in the 9th century, the sons of Emperor Constantine VI were dragged into a monastery, blinded, and forced into holy orders. They spent the rest of their lives chanting hymns while trying to forget that their cousins were stabbing each other for crowns next door. And here is the part where you nod gently, thinking, yes, monks do make excellent babysitters. Especially if you want the children to disappear quietly into prayer. Of course, sometimes the children themselves were the problem. Consider the case of John II of Castile, who left behind a young son, Henry IV, known to history as Henry the Impotent. A flattering nickname if ever there was one. His reign was a disaster of rumors, rebellions, and family feuds, all centered on whether he was truly the father of his supposed heir. Which meant that Henry's own daughter, poor Joanna, spent her life called La Beltraneja, implying she was illegitimate. She was just a child, but her existence was enough to tear Spain into civil war. So yes, being the child of a fallen king was difficult. But being the child of a failing king could be worse. And then, of course, we have France. Always France. Where royal children often had the dubious honor of watching their fathers either deposed or driven mad. Charles VI of France, for instance, went insane, believing at one point that he was made of glass. Which is not the most confidence-inspiring quality in a king. His children were caught between a French court that thought their father was incompetent, and an English army that very much agreed. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 disinherited his son in favor of the English king. Imagine being the Dauphin of France, raised to expect the crown, only to be legally informed that you were now irrelevant. That boy eventually became Charles VII, the one who owed his throne to Joan of Arc. Without her visions, he would have remained a forgotten prince, shuffled to the side while England tried to annex half of France. It's easy to imagine these royal children as pampered, privileged, untouchable. But the truth is softer, sadder, and frankly, a little ridiculous. Their crowns were paper-thin. Their futures were written not by tutors or priests, but by the whims of cousins with sharper swords. Some of them spent their lives in dark towers. Some in exile. Some in cloisters. And a few, through sheer stubborn luck, actually managed to grow up and seize power. But even those were rarely happy stories. Because when you've spent your childhood being told that everyone around you wants you dead, well, it doesn't make for the most stable adulthood. So the next time you hear a bedtime fairy tale about a king and queen living happily ever after, remember that the real endings were rarely so tidy. The children of fallen kings didn't inherit happily ever afters. They inherited paranoia, exile, and a lifetime of wondering if dinner was poisoned. And with that thought, let's drift gently onward, to more stories of royal mishaps, dynastic collapses, and the fragile children who found themselves in the middle of it all. Alright. We've wandered through the unlucky children of fallen kings. Now let's drift sideways, into something a little quieter. A little less bloody. Though of course, this being history, it still comes with the occasional stabbing. Tonight, let's think about secrets. Not our own, hopefully. But the secrets of people who lived long before locks, safes, or password-protected emails. How did you hide something when iron padlocks were rare, keys were expensive, and privacy was more of a suggestion than a right? Well, the short answer is, badly. But let's take our time and explore how badly. Imagine you're a Roman senator. You've written a letter complaining about the emperor's taste in chariots. A dangerous thing to do, since emperors tended to have surprisingly sensitive egos. You can't exactly drop it in a locked safe. So what did you do? The Romans had a method called a tabula serrata, a wax tablet. You'd write your message into the soft wax with a stylus, then fold the tablet shut and tie it with string. Finally, you pressed a wax seal over the knot. A seal carried your personal mark, perhaps a family crest, or a vaguely intimidating eagle. The idea was simple: if the seal was intact, the letter was untouched. If broken, someone had peeked. Of course, this meant nothing if the person who broke the seal also owned hot wax and a steady hand. Which, inconveniently, many nosy Roman officials did. So your secret letter about the emperor's chariot probably lasted all of 5 minutes. Further east, in China, people had their own approaches. The imperial court loved bureaucracy. If you think your workplace produces too much paperwork, the Ming dynasty would have laughed at you. They wrote endless reports, many of them sensitive. So how were secrets kept? One way was secrecy through sheer quantity. If you bury the important message under 600 pages of rice tax statistics, no one wants to read far enough to find it. A strategy still practiced today in the form of burying bad news in long emails. There were also physical tricks. Some letters were rolled and tied with multiple knots. Others were tucked inside bamboo tubes, sealed with clay. Clay sealing was clever. Once hardened, it couldn't be removed without crumbling. Unless, of course, you had more clay. Which most people did. But let's drift gently into the Middle Ages. When the world grew fond of locked chests, not because they were safe, but because they looked reassuringly heavy. If you had money or jewels to hide, you didn't rely on a lock. You relied on a chest so big that moving it required 4 men and a horse. The theory was simple: if thieves couldn't carry it, they couldn't steal it. Which works right up until you realize thieves also owned axes. Documents were often secured by folding them in elaborate ways. Medieval letters were sometimes folded into their own envelopes, what historians now call letter locking. You'd fold the paper, tuck it into itself, and seal it with wax in a manner that made tampering obvious. Think of it as origami with trust issues. One famous example comes from Queen Elizabeth I of England. She received countless folded letters from foreign spies and schemers, all sealed with delicate slits, twists, and wax drops. The idea was that if the seal was broken, Elizabeth would know the letter had been opened. In reality, her spymaster Francis Walsingham could unseal and reseal these letters so neatly that the senders never suspected. Which is why Elizabeth I survived more assassination plots than most people have hot dinners. Of course, if you couldn't trust wax or folding, you could always trust your own body. Enter the charming tradition of hiding things on messengers. Small letters were sewn into clothing. Tiny scrolls were rolled and slipped into hollow shoe heels. More desperate messages were sometimes swallowed, which works well enough until the messenger is caught and politely asked to use the facilities under guard. At which point, your secret doesn't seem very secret anymore. During the American Revolution, for instance, invisible ink was widely used. But before that, in medieval Europe, people occasionally relied on the equally subtle method of writing messages on raw eggs. You'd inscribe the words with vinegar, let them dry, then boil the egg. The message would be invisible until the shell was peeled. The problem, of course, was that hungry guards sometimes ate the evidence before it could be revealed. Not all secrets were political. Some were personal. Medieval noblewomen, for instance, kept love letters tucked into prayer books. The safest place to hide something scandalous was between the pages of a Bible, because no priest wanted to be caught rifling through the scriptures for gossip. Monks also kept secrets, though theirs were often strange. A monk might hide alchemical recipes in the margins of a psalm, or press notes between layers of parchment. Some monasteries even used chained libraries, where every book was literally chained to the shelf. Not to protect the knowledge, but to make sure no one smuggled out the latest thrilling commentary on St. Augustine. We also have the wonderful world of false bottoms and secret compartments. Early furniture was full of them. Chests with double lids. Desks with sliding panels. Beds with drawers that pretended to be supports. The noble art of hiding things in furniture is older than IKEA, though considerably sturdier. And sometimes the secret wasn't physical at all, it was linguistic. Codes and ciphers go back thousands of years. Julius Caesar used his famous shift cipher, where each letter was replaced by one 3 places later in the alphabet. Not exactly sophisticated. Anyone with half an hour and a jug of wine could solve it. But it did the job. By the Renaissance, codes grew more elaborate. Diplomats wrote letters in complex ciphers, hoping their enemies couldn't crack them. Of course, their enemies usually could. The history of cryptography is basically the history of people thinking they were cleverer than they were. It's worth noting that most secrets weren't very secret at all. Court gossip was practically a sport. Servants gossiped in kitchens, scribes whispered in archives, and spies stood behind curtains pretending to admire the tapestry. If a king wanted to hide something, an affair, a debt, a murder, half the court usually knew about it before breakfast. Even Henry VIII, who enjoyed beheading people for talking too much, couldn't keep his scandals quiet. Everyone knew when his marriages were falling apart. Everyone knew when he was chasing yet another lady-in-waiting. The only people surprised by his decisions were his wives. So, how did people keep secrets before locks and safes? The honest answer, they didn't. They tried. They folded papers, pressed wax seals, carved compartments, tied knots, scribbled ciphers. But human curiosity was always faster. There was always someone willing to bribe a servant, open a chest, or eat an egg just to see what was written on it. And maybe that's the real secret here. That secrecy itself is a kind of illusion. Even in our own age of encrypted passwords and steel safes, most secrets get out eventually. They did in Rome. They did in Byzantium. They did in Tudor England. So perhaps the safest place to keep a secret was never in wax, or paper, or wood. It was in silence. Which, of course, was the one thing nobody in history ever managed to keep. And with that thought, let's drift a little further, into the everyday lives of people long gone. Because the next question is a gentle one. What did cavemen actually do all day? Alright. We've wandered through the unlucky children of fallen kings, and drifted past the secretive little tricks people tried before locks and safes. Now let's take a quieter step forward, into the very ordinary, and sometimes very unappetizing, question of food. Because soldiers, for all their glorious banners and shiny helmets, still had to eat. And armies, for all their dramatic battles and stirring speeches, mostly spent their time walking. Walking, and eating, and occasionally complaining about both. So, what did soldiers actually eat while marching? The answer is, not much, and not very well. But let's stretch it out, softly, as we follow them down dusty roads across the centuries. If you were a Roman legionary, for instance, your daily rations were famously dull. Bread. More bread. And sometimes, to liven things up, a bit of bread. The Romans issued each soldier a portion of wheat, yes, raw wheat. The army didn't even bother grinding it for you. You carried it in a sack, like an unhappy baker, and once the camp was set up, you were expected to grind, knead, and bake it yourself. Imagine marching 20 miles with 70 pounds of gear, then spending the evening baking your own bread. It was less, Glory of Rome, and more, Great Roman Bake-Off, Field Edition. If you were lucky, you might get a chunk of cheese, some dried fruit, or a drizzle of sour wine called Posca. Posca was wine so bad it had to be diluted with water and flavored with herbs. But it did kill germs, which is more than you can say for most ancient beverages. Meat was rare. Roman soldiers were sometimes given bacon, but mostly they relied on beans, lentils, and whatever they could scavenge from local farmers. which meant Roman conquest was accompanied by Roman shopping, raiding granaries, borrowing livestock, and occasionally liberating cabbages from nearby fields. Drifting forward to medieval knights, surely their meals were better? Well, no. Not unless you like salted pork. When knights and their retinues marched, they lived on hardtack, which is a polite term for rock-like biscuits designed to survive several centuries without going moldy. Hardtack had the texture of roof tiles and the taste of disappointment. To make it edible, soldiers often dunked it in ale, stew, or anything liquid enough to soften it before it cracked a tooth. Alongside hardtack came salted meat, usually pork or beef, salted so heavily that it could outlast the soldier himself. After weeks on the road, you could identify a knight by the distinctive rattle of salt crystals in his stomach. Dried peas, beans, and oats also appeared in their packs. Oats could be boiled into porridge, which at least offered warmth. Sometimes soldiers carried onions or garlic, which served as flavor, medicine, and breath freshener for scaring off the enemy. And when supplies ran low, there was always pillaging. Nothing kept morale up quite like foraging, which was the medieval term for stealing chickens from peasants while insisting it was for the greater good of Christendom. By the early modern era, with the rise of professional standing armies, logistics began to improve. Or at least, commanders pretended they did. During the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, soldiers were technically issued rations of bread, meat, and beer. In practice, these supplies almost never arrived on time. Soldiers lived on whatever the countryside could provide, which often meant stripping entire villages bare. One German proverb from the period summed it up: where the soldier has passed, the grass grows no more. Which is poetic, if slightly depressing for the farmers. French armies under Louis XIV, meanwhile, tried to organize better. Soldiers carried bread baked in advance, along with dried vegetables, beans, and the occasional slab of cheese. But the army was so enormous that feeding it became impossible without robbing the local population. Which they did, with enthusiasm. And what about sailors? They were technically soldiers at sea, after all. Their diets deserve a sleepy mention. Sailors lived on salted beef, dried fish, hardtack, and more salted beef. Fresh food lasted only a few days, so after that it was just salt, and weevils. Yes, hardtack biscuits were often crawling with little beetles. Sailors would tap them on the table to knock the bugs out. Some men didn't bother, reasoning that the weevils were extra protein. Citrus was added later, once scurvy became a recognized problem. Before that, sailors simply watched their teeth fall out, one by one, while gnawing on biscuits as hard as the deck boards. Back on land, 18th and 19th century armies developed the idea of field kitchens. Large copper pots followed the soldiers, producing endless stews known as slumgullion or bullet soup. Recipes varied, but the main ingredient was usually despair. Napoleon's armies relied heavily on bread and soup. Each soldier carried a small pot to cook whatever could be boiled. They also received meat rations, salted, of course, and sometimes a ration of wine. Napoleon famously said that, an army marches on its stomach. Which is true. Though in practice, his army marched mostly on slightly undercooked porridge and watery broth. In the American Civil War, rations became standardized. Union soldiers received salt pork, beans, coffee, and hardtack. Confederate soldiers, meanwhile, often received very little. Southern supply lines were weak, so Confederate troops sometimes boiled cornmeal into mush, fried it when possible, and called it dinner. Soldiers on both sides foraged whenever they could. Chickens, apples, wild berries, all were fair game. Diaries are full of wistful notes about stolen pies. Imagine risking your life in battle, only to discover the highlight of your week was eating half a cherry pie you found cooling on a windowsill. And finally, drifting gently into the 20th century, rations became industrial. Tins of bully beef. cans of beans, packaged biscuits. In World War I, British soldiers became depressingly familiar with tinned corned beef, which they nicknamed bully beef. It was greasy, salty, and unavoidable. American soldiers had canned meat, beans, and hard biscuits. Later, chocolate was added, partly for morale. Imagine the joy of finding something sweet after months of mud, rats, and rain. In World War II, rations became more elaborate but not necessarily tastier. The British had compo packs, which included tea, biscuits, and the occasional tin of jam. The Americans had K rations, boxed meals with crackers, cheese spread, and powdered drinks. The Germans issued black bread and sausage, until shortages reduced it mostly to bread and a faint memory of sausage. And through it all, soldiers kept complaining. Which is fair. Because if you've walked 20 miles in heavy boots, the least the world owes you is something better than a biscuit full of beetles. So, what did soldiers actually eat on the march? Bread, mostly. Salted meat. Beans. Gruel. Hardtack. Food designed not to delight, but simply to keep legs moving. And perhaps that's the quiet truth here. Armies may win wars with banners and cannons, but they survive on porridge and pork fat. Glory may fill the speeches, but dinner fills the stomach. So the next time you imagine knights charging into battle, or legionaries conquering Gaul, remember that before the trumpets and the clashing swords, there was supper. Probably bland. Definitely salty. But just enough to keep them walking. And with that, let's drift onward, into the quiet halls of monasteries, where another question waits. What happened to monks who broke their vows? So far, we've drifted past unlucky royal children, secret letters that were never quite secret, and soldiers trudging through history on a diet of bread, beans, and disappointment. Now let's turn down a quieter corridor of history. A stone cloister. A wooden bench polished smooth by centuries of elbows. The hushed life of the medieval monastery. Because monks, in theory, lived in peaceful devotion. But in reality, they were human. And humans break rules. Which raises a sleepy little question: what happened when monks broke their vows? The short answer is, nothing pleasant. The long answer is, let's explore, slowly. First, what vows are we talking about? The classic, triple package: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty meant you owned nothing. Chastity meant no sex. Obedience meant doing whatever your abbot said, even when it involved weeding the same patch of garden for the 12th day in a row. On paper, it sounded like a recipe for spiritual purity. In practice, it was more like a ticking time bomb of frustration. Not everyone is cut out for lifelong celibacy, communal meals, and a wardrobe limited to scratchy wool. Let's start with poverty. This vow, oddly enough, was broken quite often. Monks weren't supposed to own anything, but plenty of them developed mysterious personal collections. A nice pen here, an extra pair of boots there, a suspicious stash of coins, borrowed from the alms box. Punishments varied. A monk caught hoarding might be forced to publicly confess, hand over the goods, and spend a few weeks on bread and water. Which, to be fair, was not much different from the normal menu. In worse cases, they could be flogged, because nothing says spiritual poverty quite like being whipped for owning 2 spoons. But monasteries also turned a blind eye, especially when the hoarder was useful. Some abbots enjoyed their own secret luxuries. A little wine, a feather pillow, perhaps even a trained songbird. Poverty, it seems, was negotiable. Next, chastity. Now here's where things get interesting. Or awkward, depending on your perspective. Monks were supposed to be celibate, but monasteries were not exactly islands. They had kitchens staffed by lay servants. Visitors came and went. Pilgrims stopped by. And just beyond the cloister walls, there were villages full of very normal, very human temptations. When monks broke chastity, the punishments could be harsh. A monk caught with a woman might be whipped, stripped of privileges, or locked in a cell for months of penance. Chronic offenders were sometimes expelled from the order entirely, thrown back into the secular world with little more than a robe and a reputation. But not every scandal ended badly. Some monks simply left. They ran away with lovers, abandoned the cloister, and tried to build new lives. The church officially condemned this, of course, but enforcement was patchy. Records from medieval courts show plenty of former monks turning up in towns, running businesses, or quietly marrying into respectable families. One notorious example comes from the 14th century. A Benedictine monk named Richard left his abbey to live with a woman. When dragged back by church officials, he argued that God had called him to marriage. The court disagreed. He was flogged and locked up. But within a year, he escaped again. Richard clearly preferred domestic life to chanting psalms at dawn. And who can blame him? Now we drift to obedience. The vow of obedience meant doing whatever your abbot told you. Which sounds fine, until your abbot was corrupt, tyrannical, or simply fond of long sermons. Disobedient monks could be punished with fasting, beatings, or isolation. One chronic problem was silence. Many orders required long stretches of silence, especially during meals. Monks who broke this rule by whispering, joking, or humming quietly to themselves could be sentenced to eat alone. Which, in the social economy of a monastery, was devastating. Imagine centuries of introverts finally finding their people, only to be punished by being sent to the medieval equivalent of the quiet table. Some monks, of course, broke all three vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience together. These were usually the troublemakers, the ones who secretly drank, gambled, snuck out at night, and occasionally brawled. Yes, monastic brawls were a thing. Picture two monks in wool habits, swinging at each other with fists or candlesticks, while horrified novices tried to break it up. Chronic offenders were sometimes imprisoned inside the monastery. Many large abbeys had their own cells, tiny stone rooms where disobedient monks were locked up with bread, water, and a Bible. The unlucky ones stayed there for months. Which does make you wonder how much spiritual progress can be made while sulking in solitary confinement. Not all discipline was cruel. Some punishments were surprisingly theatrical. Monks might be ordered to lie flat on the floor during meals, while the rest of the community stepped around them. Or to wear their habits inside out, as a sign of shame. Others were made to stand outside the church during services, like badly behaved schoolboys sent to the hallway. It was humiliation as therapy. The idea was to break pride, to cure disobedience with a healthy dose of embarrassment. Whether it worked is another matter. And then, there were the big scandals. Entire monasteries sometimes fell into corruption. Chronicles are full of reports about abbots who grew rich, monks who fathered children, and cloisters that turned into little more than country clubs for the lazy nobility. In the 12th century, reformers like Bernard of Clairvaux complained bitterly about fat monks, idly eating, drinking, and hunting. He probably wasn't exaggerating. Some monasteries became notorious for feasting and drunkenness, breaking the vow of poverty so enthusiastically that they rivaled royal courts. The punishment here wasn't flogging. It was reform. New orders like the Cistercians sprang up, vowing to do monasticism properly: simplicity, hard work, and stricter rules. Which lasted, of course, until the Cistercians themselves grew comfortable. And then yet another reform movement had to appear. Monastic history is essentially one long cycle of rules, corruption, reform, repeat. Now, what about nuns? Their vows were the same, and their scandals just as colorful. Nuns caught breaking chastity were sometimes walled up alive. Others were expelled, forced to wear secular clothes again, and sent home in disgrace. Yet, as with monks, many nuns simply escaped, living new lives far from the cloister. One German abbess in the 15th century was notorious for hosting lavish banquets in her convent, complete with musicians and wine. The church disapproved, naturally. But somehow she kept her position. Perhaps the bishop enjoyed the banquets too much to complain. It's worth noting that not all monks who broke vows were punished harshly. Some were quietly forgiven. Others were simply ignored, especially if they were high-ranking or well-connected. A wealthy nobleman turned monk might get away with far more than a poor farm boy turned novice. As always, class had its privileges, even in the cloister. And then, of course, there were those monks who broke their vows intellectually. They questioned doctrine. They wrote books criticizing corruption. They challenged authority. These were the dangerous ones, not for their lust or their greed, but for their ideas. Some ended up on trial for heresy. Others fled into exile. And a few, like Martin Luther, set off entire revolutions. Which only proves that the loudest rule-breakers sometimes reshape history itself. So, what happened to monks who broke their vows? Some were flogged. Some were humiliated. Some were imprisoned. Some were expelled. And some, quietly, stubbornly, slipped away into ordinary lives. The monastery was supposed to be a refuge from the world. But for many, it was simply another version of the world, full of temptation, rebellion, mistakes, and the occasional brawl with candlesticks. And perhaps that's the most comforting truth of all. Even in the most disciplined cloisters, behind thick stone walls, among rows of chanting brothers, people were still people. Weak, restless, flawed, and often very hungry. Which makes the past feel less distant. And far more human. And now, with that thought, let's let the cloister grow quiet again. The candles flicker, the chants fade, and we'll drift softly onward, to the next strange corner of history.